Spider-Man Hostile Takeover. Chapter 24. Who here wants to play a game of Guess What the Kingpin is Thinking? Spider-Man was in a gambling den under a Hell's Kitchen restaurant. He knew it was owned by Fisk, and it raked in big profits every night. It was supposed to, anyhow. Not tonight. He held a big bag of money that was going to leave at the nearest feast shelter. Most of the patrons had fled when he came in. Now it was just the boss and the muscle. They weren't going anywhere because they were webbed up in this mess of overturned furniture, scattered cards, strewn chips, and empty beer bottles. "I'm looking for information," he said. "What's Fisk up to? Why does he have someone impersonating me? What's his favorite brand of protein powder? That dude is huge!" "No one's gonna tell you anything," the boss said. "Just put the money down and walk away. You don't want Mr. Fisk angry with you." "Yeah, because I can't imagine what that would be like." He held up the bag of money again. "Last chance before I put you on the hook for the missing cash." No one had anything to say, so he darted out the door, up the stairs, and left. Another evening impending Fisk operation. Another night that brought him absolutely no closer to finding out what was going on. A few hours later, after disrupting another gambling den, a brothel, and a hijacking operation, he was still no closer to getting what he wanted. A call came in from Yuri Watanabe, so he webbed up to a rooftop to talk. "I hear you're having quite a night," she said. "You're stealing from Fisk now?" "I'm not stealing," he said. "I'm redistributing wealth." "That's not what the perps are telling us." "Then I guess it must be true," he said. "Perps wouldn't lie." "I'm just saying, this makes you look bad," she told him. "Check the Daily Bugle webpage." After he hung up, he did as she advised. There was the headline. "Has Spider-Man turned Spider Thief?" Not exactly on the same level as some of the gyms from J. Jonah Jameson days, and not the worst thing imaginable. It was better than "Spider-Man continues to terrorize city," which one of the city's newspaper had run the day before. All part of doing business, he told himself, but he didn't feel all that convinced. How long could he continue to knock over tables and tear up gambling ledgers? None of these guys were ever going to tell him anything. Whatever Kingpin was up to, whatever would make him too big to fail, it wasn't going to be stopped by redistributing his poker earnings. Every time Spider-Man thought about giving up, he'd see Anika's face, and he'd remember what drove him. This was a matter of the purest sort of justice. He'd known Anika, and so she was the face on the 12 people who had died. But elsewhere, in the city, there were others mourning. Parents and children and friends, demanding answers, demanding someone pay. The thought stoked a cold fury in him, a fire he had to channel. He had the power to punish those responsible. And because he had the power, he had the responsibility. At the hijacking operation, he found paperwork leading back to a warehouse supposedly full of goods stolen by Fisk's thugs. He figured he'd go there and see if anyone was feeling chatty. He was on his way when a call came from MJ. "Remember me?" she said. "We went to high school together?" "I know," he said with a sigh. "I've been a little obsessive," she suggested. "Weird and moody?" "Exactly. I'm glad you understand." "For what it's worth, I do understand," she said. "You're not able to sit back and hope something happens. That's why I'm calling. I have a lead that might be of use." "Really?" "I was in Fisk Tower today." "Again?" It escaped before he could call the word back. "Peter, my job, remember? I interview people." "Not all those people need to be Wilson Fisk," he said. though he knew it was exactly what he shouldn't say. Anyhow, she said, speeding over the bumps in their conversational road, I literally ran into some walking slabs of muscle from Roxxon Black Ridge, the military contractors. Interesting, he said. Any idea what they're up to? Couldn't get anything out of them, she said. But apparently, they keep a schedule. They may be getting their marching orders from Fisk on a regular basis. She told Peter everything she learned from the security guard. There was no way to know how it fit into the picture, if it did at all. But it was something, and something was exactly what he needed. Bingham climbed into the window of his apartment. Sure, no one had seen him. He could never be sure, really. Not in New York. Anyone might be looking out their window and see a guy in a spider suit coming and going. To be sure, he'd have to have some sort of sixth sense. Still, he figured he was in the clear. If not, he'd deal with it later. Let them try to come for him. He sat heavily on his bed and pulled off the mask. He liked the feeling when fresh air washed over him, but he also missed the hot, constricted feeling. Something was always lost when something else was gained. He learned that one for sure. It had been an entertaining evening, watching the false Spider-Man messing with Fisk's gambling places. The guy was starting to lose it, and it was fun watching him unravel. A couple of times Bingham had to fight the urge to step in, to take on the impersonator. The true Spider-Man versus the imposter. That would be something to see. But it wasn't yet the time. It wasn't the mission. He didn't follow the impersonator every night, but often enough. Bingham couldn't always find him, though there were places he could go to hide and wait, and the impersonator would swing by eventually. He was predictable enough if he knew how to think. Most people didn't, but Bingham did. Tonight, he just watched. But one of these days, he'd see an opportunity, a way to make his life miserable. And when he saw it, he'd strike. The next morning he was there before 7:30, in plenty of time to watch 3 beefy men in suits enter Fisk Tower. If they came out with assignments, which is what Spider-Man assumed was happening, he could follow them. If he got very lucky, he learned something of value. Perched on the edge of the building, he picked up a cup of coffee he bought from a food truck around the block. The owner refused to take his money. At least a few people hadn't given up hope on him. Lifting the bottom of his mask, he took a sip. The coffee was still steaming. It was pure chance. She was about to leave her suite and head down for her first meeting of the day when a flash of red and blue struck her from across the street. Though it was distant, she was certain it was a person in a Spider-Man suit. At first, she thought it had to be Bingham. But when she looked through the binoculars, she realized it was him. There were enough minor differences that she could be sure. Maybe a typical person wouldn't notice, but Maya didn't miss those sort of details. What was he doing here? It looked like he was watching Fisk Tower, but in broad daylight? She couldn't imagine why. As she watched, he picked up a cup of coffee, folded up the bottom of his mask, and took a sip. It was jarring. She'd always known there was an actual person under the mask, but she ceased to think of him as anything ordinary. That he would sip a cup of coffee and then wipe his mouth with the back of his hand. It was uncanny. On a subconscious level, she expected there to be nothing under the mask but a void of evil. Even if he was a coffee-drinking human being, it didn't make him any less of a monster. He thought he could come here, spy on them, work against everybody they hoped to accomplish. What could anyone do about it, after all? It wasn't like anyone would be able to follow him. He hadn't counted on Maya Lopez. He hadn't counted on a woman who was an echo. She grabbed her phone and quickly scanned the morning schedule. Nothing that couldn't be rearranged. She sent a quick text to her admin and then prepared to run outside. Then she stopped. A pencil skirt wasn't exactly the right thing to wear when leaping from roof to roof. She needed something that would give her the necessary flexibility. Casting her work clothes onto the floor, she changed into what she's been wearing when she had chased after Bingham. Black pants, a black top, gloves. Maya looked at her reflection in the mirror. Maybe, she thought, this was the day she would confront him. Mr. Fisk said it wasn't time. But some things weren't about choice. Sometimes, destiny chose for you. Is this, she asked herself, what she wanted to look like when she finally met him in combat? She wanted him to see her true self. She wanted him to look at her and fear her. She thought of that night in Montana, the bloody handprint. Red wasn't right, though. Something subtle. She was like a ghost, out of her own past. White. It had to be white. She began to search for her old collection of stage makeup from her dance days. It was time for Echo to become more than an idea. It was time for Echo to become a name. The contractors came out of the building almost exactly 15 minutes after they went in. Peter prepared to follow them, but they immediately split up, each taking a different, though identical dark SUV. Without much time to consider his options, he picked one at random, and he was off. Following cars wasn't hard at all when they remained in the city. Bridges and tunnels presented certain problems, though he could usually hitch a ride. The trick there was avoid getting spotted. Nothing blew a stealthy pursuit like wildly enthusiastic honking. Fortunately, the car he was following stayed in Manhattan. In this time of the day, that meant it couldn't travel too fast. He kept with it as it headed uptown, leaping from roof to roof, wall to wall, careful to stay out of the view of anyone on the ground. The weird thing was the faint tingling from his spider sense. He looked behind him a few times, but saw no one of anyone on his tail. Maybe it was because these guys were dangerous, he told himself. He would need to be careful. He was always careful, but he had to know what they were up to. The car he was following stopped at Broadway and 147th Street. Keeping to the rooftops, Spider-Man watched the Roxxon Blackridge contractors get out and linger at a bus stop, all the while keeping his eye on a nearby brownstone. 20 minutes after he arrived, a woman came out of the brownstone, holding a little girl's hand. She began to walk down the street, and the contractor followed her. He had his phone out, and from time to time, he took pictures. The woman dropped the little girl off at a daycare center. The contractor stepped into a greengrocer, lingering around the entrance. He took half a dozen photos. She left, and he followed her for another 4 blocks. Where he photographed her, buying what Spider-Man felt certain had to be heroin. What did it mean? Who was this woman? Why did the contractor want her to get pictures of her buying drugs? The easiest way to find out might be to question her, but she wouldn't likely tell her a life story. When a guy in a costume drops from the sky, you don't immediately volunteer your darkest secrets. Spider-Man made a note of her address. Maybe he could ask Watanabe to see what she could find out about the woman. Trailing the contractor hadn't turned up the smoking gun he'd been looking for, but it could still turn out to be an important piece of the puzzle. Following the contractor back to his car, he was careful to duck behind a digital billboard on a rooftop to be sure he wasn't seen. He was watching the contractor drive off when his spider sense went into high gear. He rolled away, trying to get a sense of what exactly was going on. Then he saw her, a woman all in black, with black hair tied back, and carrying a spear. She had a white handprint across her face. Not exactly a mask, but making her difficult to identify. He didn't dwell on it for long, though. He'd been attacked with some improbable things over the years. If he was going to be honest with himself, it could be argued that he was also dressed a little wacky. So who was he to judge? He was more interested in the part where she was trying to kill him, while the billboard behind him formed itself into a car ad. The woman lashed out with her spear. He dodged to his left, but it turned out the jab was a feint, and he only twisted out of the way to avoid getting impaled. He dodged and rolled, but she dodged and rolled as well. He leapt at an angle. She leapt at an angle, mirroring him exactly. It seemed as if she could emulate his every move. Meanwhile, the billboard changed again, this time turning into an ad for, of all things, the Fisk Foundation. Perfect. The woman with the handprint on her face moved in toward him, her every step seeming to be a copy of his own. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if this could be his impersonator. Then he discarded the thought. His double had a male voice and physique, and while this woman echoed his every move, she lacked his enhanced abilities. She could leap the way he did, but not as far or as high. She could push herself off walls the way he did, but not cling to them. It was more like parkour. She certainly had no web shooters. They faced off again, and Peter managed to dodge 3 fast jabs from the spear. The third one missed him by a mile, slamming into the billboard, sending off a shower of sparks. "Hold on," he said. "Can we talk about this?" She came at him with a side swipe, acting as if she hadn't even heard him. Another miss, and another shower of sparks shot out. He leapt out of the way, wanting to get away from the billboard in case it exploded. He shot out 2 large webs to catch her, but she rolled away as if she knew exactly what he was going to do even before he did it. And that, he realized, was how this woman was different. The doppelganger was like another Spider-Man in his abilities, but not his style. There were similarities. The way 2 mixed martial arts fighters or 2 taekwondo practitioners would always have certain core moves in common, but their approaches would never be identical. Spider-Man and his imitator were similar because they were working with the same set of abilities, even if they used them differently. This woman was copying him, and the mimicry was precise. That was the only word for it. Not that she mimicked him as he moved. It was more like she had internalized every move he'd ever make, turning herself into his mirror image. Yet watching her dodge, leap, attack, feint, and roll, he thought she must have studied hundreds of hours of Spider-Man doing his thing. While she didn't have the gifts he'd received from that radioactive spider, normal abilities were nothing to be sneezed at. He'd been smacked around pretty handily by people who were just regular old human beings. This one was fast, angry, and she had a spear. "I like your style," he said. "You seem like a really terrific person. But I've got an impaling phobia, so let's skip the skewering. How about you just tell me what you want?" Her only response was trying to put a hole in him. "Well, this is no fun," he said as he leapt out of her way and out of her range. Planting his feet, he turned toward her, hands up in a position of surrender, and walked forward. "Why don't you just tell me what this is all about?" "We could get lattes." She feinted twice, and he dodged easily. Then she lunged forward toward a spot she knew he would be. She was good. and she knew how to anticipate him. But now that he knew what she could do, it was simply too fast for her. By the time the thrust came, he was out of the way, if only by inches. So you won't talk, and I'm not going to let you slice me open, even if you are the second best Spider-Man impersonator in the city. So, lady, miss, whatever you are, I'm out of here. He reached out to cast the web, but she anticipated that too. Her spear came down in a hard swing, knocking his arm. The web shot out to the concrete beneath them, and he followed it, hitting the ground hard. That was an epic fail, and he really hoped no one had caught it on camera. She circled around him with astonishing speed and struck him across the back of the knees with the shaft of the spear. She was strong. He rolled out of the way, but she clipped him with the shaft again, propelling him backward into the billboard, sending a halo of sparks into the air. It hurt like hell. She came in for a third swing and he managed to roll away toward the edge of the roof, taking a few photos as he did so. All he had to do was drop off and he'd be free of her. But the point wasn't really to escape, was it? She'd gotten in some good shots, but he wasn't afraid of her. Okay, he was a little afraid. But this wasn't like taking a beating from the Rhino. There was no chance of getting pounded into goo here. Besides, he was curious. How had this woman learned to move like him? What did she want? Was she connected with the other imitator? Could she tell anything he needed to know? Through their entire encounter, she hadn't uttered a word. But it was surprising how conversational people became once they were nicely webbed. It was time to stop worrying about hurting the nice lady with the spear and start finding out what she was up to. The next time she came at him, he knew exactly how to play it. She rushed forward, jabbing with the spear. He leapt up, over her head, spun around, and kicked. But she was waiting for him, like she knew exactly what he was going to do. She grabbed his ankle while she was in mid-leap and yanked hard, bringing him down with a painful thud. And then, somehow she was on him. His attacker straddled him, a knee on each of his arm, keeping him pinned in place. One hand held the spear, as if she was ready to bring down with a fatal thrust to his throat. The other reached for the seam of his mask. It was like she knew exactly where it was, and she had a solid plan of unmasking him and then killing him. Throughout the fight, Spider-Man had been by turns surprised, confused, curious, and annoyed. Now, he was pretty concerned. He had very strong feelings about being unmasked and murdered. And they weren't good feelings. This was definitely something he didn't want to happen. He also wasn't that big on getting his butt handed to him by someone he outweighed by at least 30 pounds of enhanced muscles. Getting stuck with the spear is going to ruin my schedule for the week. Fortunately, he didn't have to. Her knees kept his arm from swinging. Knees were good for that sort of thing. But the thing about knees was that they were narrow and pointy. That left him a limited range of motion. He shifted his wrist and aimed his web shooter. A jerk of his wrist, and he was moving, while she was tumbling off him. As soon as he was free to spin to face her, crouching and hoping to take advantage of her confusion and pin her in place, the confusion was his, though. The woman was gone. He'd only had his eyes off of her for a few seconds, but she vanished. Maybe inside the building. Maybe she leapt to another rooftop. She could be hiding. Or she might have already scrambled down to the street. A person with a hand on her face couldn't exactly blend in. But this was still New York. And she wouldn't stand out either. If he saw someone like that, he'd figure she was on her way to a theater or dance company rehearsal. He wouldn't immediately wonder if she'd just been fighting a super cool hero dude on a roof. Spider-Man stood and unconsciously scratched at the back of his head. He hadn't been struck like a figurative pig. That was good. He managed to get smacked by a woman who clearly did a lot of strength training. but whose main ability seemed to be watching Spider-Man exercise tapes. That was bad. Also bad was that whatever connection she had to the murderous imitator, assuming there was one, remained unknown. So in short, an unimpressive display and nothing to show for himself. The Roxxon Blackridge contractor was long gone, oblivious to the drama that had played out above his head. Apparently, he'd been sent by Fisk to take pictures of an ordinary woman with an extremely troubled life. Another mystery, which was also not a win. It certainly didn't bring him any closer to Anika's murderer. It was, at least, a clue. And any morning that wasn't a complete disaster was what counted as a victory these days.